have another print disability, which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hi, this is Dick Shanley, and for the next hour I will be reading from Sunday's May 3rd issue of the New York Times opinion section on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. First article is written by Maureen Dowd, His Majesty and Our Travesty. The last time Charles came here for a state visit, nobody seemed to notice. I saw him up close during the trip in the autumn of 1985 from a stop at J.C. Penney in a suburban mall to promote British clothing to a starry state dinner. I was impressed. The Prince of Wales had a reputation back then as a bit of a wimp, always chafing in the shadow of his towering mama, resentful about being relegated to cutting ribbons. In a flashy decade full of bling kings like the New York developer Donald Trump, Charles seemed to be a man from another time. He yearned to be taken seriously and to have an impact on global issues. As the charming British actor Peter Ustinov, who attended the state dinner, told me, he has a clear sense of what he would do if allowed to. One regrets that he didn't live in 1400. As I wrote in the Times back then, he was out of his way to move past protocol and was equally at home discussing the architecture of Baltimore, the actresses on the TV show Dynasty, the opera rolls that Beverly Sills made famous, and the tenuous state of international relations. It didn't matter. No one was paying attention. He was simply the man who accompanied Princess Diana to Washington. Even without talking much, just tucking her chin slowly and looking up out of those luminous blue eyes, Diana outshone her prince. It was pretty much a total eclipse of the sun. I don't remember seeing a single picture of Charles from the state dinner. His remarks are lost to history. All eyes were on the Sloane Square Cinderella. The state dinner was Diana's fairy tale turn, conjured by her fairy godmother, Nancy Reagan. The First Lady invited John Travolta to dance with the princes and directed the Marine Band to get up to speed on the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack. She's a great mover, Travolta said of Diana, who wore a gorgeous midnight blue velvet gown and a diamond tiara. The effect of the visit was Charles who, being overshadowed by his young wife after decades of being overshadowed by his mother, did not boost his ego. The ensuing decades would be kind to Charles. Would not be kind to Charles. He was mired in scandal and pain, but in Washington the past week, Charles came into his own. 40 years after Diana's Cinderella's turn, Charles got to be a Cinderfella. In a country rife with no king's protest, this king was a tonic. He presented himself with elegance, intelligence, wit, everything that has been wanting in Washington during the Trump era. He arrived at a propitious moment to remind the autocrat in the White House why Britain's rebellious colony ran away, to escape the tyranny of an oppressive king. Out of the fires of a bitter and bloody Revolution War, the triumph of the father of this country, George Washington, and his fellow founders, was to forge a democracy founded upon the right to liberty and the rule of law, Charles said at the state dinner. In his pointed speech to Congress, he reminded the lawmakers that our Constitution, based on Magna Carta, provides checks on a tyrant's power. The king definitely schooled Donald, and Donald took it because he has always been awed by the British royal family. president was thrilled when a British newspaper did a genealogy that found he may be a distant cousin of Charles. Then again, so are the Bushes. Trump even dropped the tariffs on Scottish whiskey to please the king. Charles gently reminded the president, who has been blasting NATO for not helping bail him out of the Iran quicksand, that America's allies stepped up after 9/11. Britain battled in Afghanistan beside us and tried to rebuild it with us for 20 years. Our people have fought and fallen together in defense of the values we inherit, Charles said. The message of Trump was obvious. Don't berate us for not backing your misadventure in Iran after we went all out on America's misbegotten occupation of Afghanistan and war in Iraq. Gently mocking the territorial Trump at the state dinner, Charles noted that he's already the king of Canada. No need for another. He also teased, "Now I know you have big plans for the moon, Mr. President, but I've checked the papers and I rather suspect it is already part of the Commonwealth, I'm afraid." He quoted Shakespeare's Henry V to prompt the bellicose president to seek peace. "My speech entreats that I may know why gentle peace should not. Bless us with her former qualities." It was lovely to hear the king's English, devoid of the vengeance, blasphemy, and vulgarity common in our leader's language. The king put a salve on the blistered partnership. Trump has trashed Prime Minister Keir Starmer as cowardly and a loser for not helping with the Britain's ambassador, Christian Turner. Didn't help when he leaked comment that the special relationship America has now is with Israel. On his last state visit, Charles was in the shade of Diana's radiance. On this one, he radiated an Aileen of his own, a class act, shining next to the boorish Trump. At long last, Charles went in no one's shadow. At 77, he has done what he has always yearned to do: make his mark on the world. Readers, listeners, I don't know if you heard the speech. I happened to hear it, and it was absolutely wonderful. With his clipped British accent, he was so articulate, and the context of his speech was just right on. I wish they would play the speech again sometime. This article is written by Jamil Bowie. The Loneliness of Donald Trump. A week ago Saturday, a gunman made an attempt on President Trump's life. This was the third attempt in roughly 2 years. The first was in 2024 during a rally in Butler, where the president, still a candidate, sustained some injuries. Next attempt took place the same year, this time at his Mar-a-Lago resort in Palm Beach, where the would-be assassin was stopped before he could get close. And then we have this most recent incident at the White House Correspondents Association dinner in Washington. To add to the catalog of recent political violence, there was the assassination of the former Minnesota House Speaker Melissa Hortman and her husband last summer, as well as the killing of Turning Point USA's Charlie Kirk and an event in Utah last year. Predictably, in the wake of the attempt on Trump's life last weekend, the president and all allies immediately jumped to blame his political opponents for the incident. The deranged lies and smears against the president, his family, his supporters have led crazy people to believe crazy things, and they are inspired to commit violence because of the words Karen Lovett, the White House press secretary, said on Monday. Trump added his own 2 cents in an interview with CBS News. I do think that the hate speech of the Democrats, much more so, is very dangerous. I really think it's very dangerous for the country. The Republican argument is simple. The more Democrats criticize Trump, the more they condemn his as a malign force in American politics, the more they put his life in danger. But this argument does not stand up to scrutiny. To start, even the most heated language coming from Democrats over the past few years falls well within the boundaries of ordinary politics discourse in the United States. No elected Democrat leader has called for violence against Trump or his allies. All have condemned such violence when it has taken place, and you would be hard-pressed to find anything different among Democratic Party officials and liberal activists. The same cannot be said about the political right, who figures like Steve Bannon moves about putting heads on pikes on the two corners of the White House is a warning, and it certainly cannot be said of the president. Trump has been the most high-profile purveyor of violent language toward his opponents as he stepped out onto the national stage as a political contender in 2015. Fantasies of violence against political enemies are in fact a defining feature of Trump's political language. During his first campaign for president, he pointed the Second Amendment people when he wondered aloud whether anything could be done about a President Hillary Clinton. As the George Floyd protest consumed the country in the summer of 2020, Trump threatened violence against protesters. The thugs are dishonoring the memory of George Floyd, and I won't let that happen. When the looting starts, the shooting starts. He called for the death penalty against Mark Milley, the former chairman of the Chief of Staff, and once compared his political opposition to vermin, calling them the real threat to the nation. On the eve of the second election in 2024, he floated the use of the military to handle the enemy from within, to find us 6 people, radical left lunatics. And of course, there was a January 6, 2021 attack on the Capitol. You'll never take our country with weakness, he said to thousands of supporters at a rally outside the White House. We fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. All of this is just a small sample of the president's embrace of violence in his language. Conservatives once understood that societies are complex systems and that the reason to try to preserve certain norms and traditions to avoid needless chaos and disruption as we change and progress. We cannot predict the full consequences of what we do, and so we should choose carefully and deliberately as we navigate the world. We should be modest in our ambitions, aware of our own fallibility, and mindful of the way things can go wrong. Of course, in as much as this perspective actually shaped American conservatism, it was mostly to defend existing inequalities of hierarchies. Consider William Buckley Jr.'s defense of the Jim Crow South, or Ronald Reagan's gerrymaid against Medicare. What looked like wisdom was usually just a rhetoric trope used to justify the power that some held over others. Still, there is something to be said for that spirit of humility, especially as it relates to our politics. So it goes with Trump's embrace of violent language. If his predecessors in the White House did not speak this way, it was not because they lacked a killer instinct or were never frustrated by criticism and mockery. Rather, they understood the weight and power of the office and the way that the language, if used, could spiral out of control into actual violence and disorder. But in Trump, we have a president who isn't concerned with the impact of his language and the consequences of his words, who delights in wielding them as a weapon against others with no regard for what it might do or whom it might influence. He thought nothing, for example, of calling a group of Democratic lawmakers traitors who were guilty of seditious behavior at the highest level and who should be arrested and put on trial, even punished with death. He thinks nothing of targeting individual critics with vitriolic social media posts and threatening entire nations with total destruction. Trump may not care about the power of words, but these words still matter. They weigh in society. 10 years of violent language, 10 years of famine and flames of discord and conflict, 10 years called the effect change through violence. All of these have had an effect. It is not that Americans are new to political violence. It's one of the defining aspects of our national experience. But in the decades between the assassination of the 90s and the present, there have been a steady decline in incidents of such violence broadly defined. Trump's entry into American politics has corresponded with a reversal of the trend, with a growing sense among a number of people in society that the only way to bring out change is through the use of force. Trump did not cause the attempts on his life, but it would be dishonest to deny that he was responsible for shaping the environment in which we live, for increasing an atmosphere in which these kind of events are more likely. And as the single most visible politician in the country, an atmosphere where political violence is more likely is one in which he may find himself a target, for whatever reason the particular person happens to have. Trump's response to this latest attempt in his life was to tell his audience of journalists that this was the reason he needed a White House ballroom, a space where he could safely hold court. And there is no doubt that in addition to his megalomania, the ballroom reflects the president's desire to make the White House a North American Versailles. But one should also consider the extent to which it reflects something else, a desire to isolate himself from the world. This is a president who rarely travels beyond the confines of the White House compound or Mar-a-Lago. He rarely meets people where they are. Trump holds the occasional rally, but he does not move through the world the way most presidents have. More so than most who have held the office, he lives inside a bubble. Some of this is vanity, some of it is laziness, and some of it, I think, is fear. Trump is afraid of the world, which in a way that means he is afraid of the world he has just helped to build. Next article is written by Ross Douthat. Democrats repeat their mistakes. There are 3 polling numbers you can use to understand the condition of the Democratic Party in 2026. The first is Donald Trump's approval rating, which has dropped into the high 30s, a terrain usually associated with dramatic public rebukes and mandates for the opposition. The second is the generic congressional ballot, which promoting Democrat decent midterm election results, but is stubbornly refusing to promise a weeping mandate or a clear shot at flipping all the crucial Senate states. The third is polling for the 2020 Democratic potential primaries, in which the landing Democratic candidates is consistently Kamala Harris, the face of the party's 2024 debacle. All 3 numbers are linked to a dominant mode in Democratic politics, right? It's not rebellion or radicalism manifest, say Henry Piker's, Twitch Seymour Marxon, or Zohran Mamdani's telegenic democratic socialism. Notable as these tendencies may be, the Democrats' fundamental condition is a late Trumpian stasis, in which the president's stark unpopularity encourages opponents to imagine they can keep everything basically as it was in the Biden era, with the same broad priorities and deference to activities and interest groups, and float back to power automatically. The continuing appeal of Harris is a useful indicator of this stasis. Yes, she is unlikely to be the 2028 nominee, and part of the support is name recognition. Mitt Romney did well in such polls in 2013 and 14, but she seems to want a second run more than Romney did. And if she goes for it, she will have won notable advantage: the fact that many Democrats who find her renomination unthinkable are nonetheless incapable of acknowledging the real reason that she lost. I'll list some of those reasons. First, her party was seen as a too beholden to progressive activists on a range of issues, including immigration, crime, education, energy, and the transgender debate. Secondly, Harris's vice president was itself a creation of the 2020 identity politics moment, without which Joe Biden never would have picked her, and she succeeded him without a fight. In part, no one wanted to acknowledge her painful limits as a politician. Finally, she tried to solve both the policy problem and the identity politics through evasion and distraction, and yet more identity politics with empty rhetoric of joy and circumlocution about her past positions and a mediocre Midwestern white guy running mate. Despite being on the record taking about radical positions, Harris was never a radical politician. Rather, she was a perfectly hapless embodiment of a Democratic establishment that aspires to manage its base without ever strongly resisting its demands, and that aspired to win moderate voters not by moderating on the issues, but through a change of effect or a change of subject. That's still clearly what Democrats' elites would prefer to do, and it's also what you see in many of the figures contending for influence in the party, outsiders and insiders. Politicians as distinct as Graham Plattner, Gavin Newsom, James Talarick, and Abigail Spanberg have all offered new direction for Democrats that are primarily image-based. The theory is always, what if we had the same basic policy orientation that makes moderates distress us? Except this time we'll talk about a bearded oyster farmer, or like Trump himself on a social media bender, or like a Sunny Youth pastor, or like a former CIA officer. Spanberger won, and Plattner might win, and Tallarico could win if the Republican nominee, Ken Paxton. And in the 2028, Newsom, or yes, even Harris, 2-0, could win if J.D. Vance is dragging a failed administration behind him, like Jacob Marley's chains. But we already know that Democrats can win purple state races on anti-Trump backing, and sometimes even red state races against terrible Republican candidates. The question is whether they can win bigger and hold their guns and govern successfully, rather than just repeat the patterns of the Biden presidency and now the Trump presidency, in which a majority is won and just as quickly squandered. For that, Democrats first need to consider win over enough former Trump voters to claim a meaningful Senate majority. Something the polls don't show them doing yet. And then the need of theory of governments that doesn't immediately alienate these voters, something that is nowhere in evidence at the moment. There's still time to discover such a theory before 2028. Still a time to discover a candidate who speaks to voters, who are anti-Trump, but also still anti-left. Still time for the advance of artificial intelligence to transform the battle lines of politics. But for now, Kamala Harris, presidential frontrunner, should loom as a warning about how easily sticking together, playing nice, and relying on backlash can lead a party to repeat the exact same mistakes. Trump has overextended the empire dangerously. Written by Christopher Caldwell. a contributing opinion writer and author of The Age of Enlightenment, American since the 60s. The American-Israeli attack on Iran was more than a bad idea. It has turned into a watershed in the decline of the American empire. Some might prefer the word hegemony to describe the world over the United States leads. Since its flag does not generally fly over the lands it protects or exploits, but the rules are the same. Imperial systems, whatever you call them, last only as long as their means are adequate to their ends. And with the Iran war, President Trump has overextended the empire dangerously. A Middle Eastern military misadventure is one of the last ways the casual observer could have expected Mr. Trump's presidency to go wrong. The problems he alluded to in all three of his presidential campaigns have mostly resulted from our leaders governing beyond their means. At home, proponents of wokeness underestimated the cost and difficulties of micromanaging interactions between groups. Abroad, the mighty American Armed Forces proved to have no particular talent for democracy promotion, and the recent debacle in Iraq proved it. Overextension was a danger that President Joe Biden contemptuously dismissed. We're the United States of America, he used to say, and there's nothing we can't do. Mr. Trump's people thought that would be different. For all the grandiosity of the expression, "Make America Great Again," Trump voters did not expect them to take on the problems. The greatness would be mostly atmospheric, braggadocio, not adventuresome. The United States could become greater even if it drew to a less expansive sphere of influence. When he proclaimed an updated Monroe document refocusing American attention in the Western Hemisphere, retrenchment and what most people thought they were getting in last November National Security Strategy had the days in which the Middle East dominated American foreign policies, both long-term planning and day-to-day execution, are thankfully over. This was a logical, even an admirable foreign policy plan. Just as important, history showed it to be workable. Britain had to surrender its far-flung system of colonies and protectorates after World War II. Letting go was often awkward, sometimes left violence in its wake. But, except for the ill-fated attempt to join France and Israel in seizing the Suez Canal from Egypt in 1956, Britain did not try to hold territories it could no longer afford. It wound up on reasonably good terms with the former colonial possessions. Its disengagement was a successful, though this can be hard to see because what being managed was decline. Mr. Trump has a chance of pulling off something similar. The assumption in Washington over the past decade has been that the world engaged in a game of geostrategic musical chairs and that the music is about to stop. China may soon overmatch us, not just in military industrial capacity, but in information technology. The world will harden into a new, less favorable geostrategic configuration. This is the last moment to reshape it in America's favor. At first, Mr. Trump moved to oust China from his strongholds in the Western Hemisphere. Almost as soon as he returned to office, the United States pressured C.K. Hutchison, a Hong Kong-based multinational conglomerate with connections to China, to sell 2 ports in the Panama Canal Zone. Venezuela, dependent on China as a market for 80% of its oil, saw American troops abduct its president, Nicolas Maduro, last winter. And Mr. Trump has warned that Cuba, a destination for Chinese investment, is next. It will also better the thinking goes if the United States has a more secure foothold near the North Pole, a foothold such as Greenland. When the time comes to divvy up the energy and mineral resources that global warming unlocks, whether or not the hemispheric policy is defensible, there is a coherence to it. The attack on Iran was different. It was not a defensive consolidation. It was assumption of a dangerous, open-end responsibility. Yes, it might be better if it might be better if the mullahs fell. But for the United States, an energy-independent country withdrawing to its own hemisphere, this is not a vital interest. War with Iran was not on the radar screen of anyone in the administration just a few months ago. That is because the United States lacks the military means to impose its will on Iran in a long conflict. In 1991, $1 million from more than 40 countries were needed to reverse the invasion of Kuwait carried out by Saddam Hussein's Iraq, a country less sophisticated than Iran and a fraction of its size. When Iran and Iraq fought each other in a standstill in the 80s, deaths ran into hundreds of thousands on each side. The United States would have to send a significant portion of its armed forces, which total only 1.3 million troops, to stand a chance of subduing Iran, and that force, if successful, would have to stay for a long time. The argument can be made that the United States no longer depends on mustering huge armies. It has sophisticated missiles and other standard weapons, but these weapons are needed to defend allies and interests in other theaters, and the United States is running them down. According to a report in the New York Times, it has already used 1,100 long-term stealth cruise missiles embarked for potential conflicts in Asia, leaving just 1,500 in the stockpile, and fired an additional 1,000 Tomahawk cruise missiles, about 10 times as many as the military buys in an average year. American leaders have been scolding the European allies for years about the inadequacy of their fighting forces. But if one measures America's military might against our pretensions rather than our GDP, it is just as inadequate. It would be wrong to say the United States is trapped in a war that it started. It has options, but is now going to pay a very steep price, no matter which of them he chooses. Can desist in Iraq, having demonstrated, for no good reason, that its military is far less dominant than the world had assumed, or it can draw resources from theaters that are of vital interest, such as Europe and East Asia, to fund what the president refers to as Iranian excursion, or it can resort to the extreme military options Mr. Trump darkly alluded in a social media post in early April, which will redound to the everlasting shame of the country it leads. The United States to lose its reputation, its friends, or its soul. Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel urged that the war on Mr. Trump because he too recognized the musical chairs logic of the moment. Once the music stops, the U.S. Excuse me. Sorry. Once the music stops, the U.S. may lack the firepower to protect Israel from its neighbors in the traditional manner and will probably lack the inclination. Ironically, the war's catastrophic outcome shows Mr. Netanyahu's basic understanding to have been sound. Israel's prospects for enlisting the U.S. in such anachronistic adventures were dwindling. Mr. Trump's gullibility provided Mr. Netanyahu with the last chance. It is tempting to ask where in the process of imperial decline the United States finds itself. Certainly has elements in common with Britain a century ago: deindustrialization, overcommitted, complacent. On the eve of World War I, Britain was dependent on Germany for industrial and even military technology, and unwillingly to re-examine the free trade system on which German supremacy had been built. By the eve of World War II, Britain was essentially bankrupt. There are parallels in America's dependence on China today. The skepticism about American hegemony that led America to turn to Mr. Trump was a healthy one. If a globalist system built on free trade, democracy promotion, and images migration is so great, Trump voters ask, then why we have to borrow $35 trillion since we took it up? It's a genuine good question. Mr. Trump was a perfect candidate for Americans who suspected something had gone wrong with their elites. His argument basically was that American-led globalism was so beneficial to politicians that once in power, they would defend it even against their voters, no matter what they said while campaigning. Events, alas, have proved them right. Who will stand up to the justices? With this decision last week in Louisiana versus Callis, the Supreme Court gutted a core part of the Voting Rights Act. Congress' landmark prohibition on voting rules that had the effect of excluding people of color from the political process. In doing so, the courts has not for the first time claimed an authority to reject laws passed by Congress in a series of equal justice in a free society. And it has effectively killed the second Reconstruction, the mid-20th century civil rights revolution. In the face of the decision, Congress must once again defend democracy from a hostile court. A plan of action already exists. When the Supreme Court challenged the first Reconstruction Act 150 years ago, abolitionists and Republicans in Congress debated measures ranging from declaring certain federal laws beyond judicial reach to changing the number of justices. The partial measures they enacted saved Reconstruction for a time, but more relevant for us today are the comprehensive reforms that proposed but never fully enacted. These reforms offer our representatives in Congress the tools we need now. In the era surrounding the Civil War, opponents of slavery confronted a Supreme Court that was threatening their life's work. In Dred Scott versus Stanford in 1857, the court declared unconstitutional the Missouri Compromise, a congressional statute banning the spread of slavery in federal territory. A decade later, the court summarily menaced the Reconstruction laws that Congress was enacting to begin the practice of multiracial democracy and the wreckage of the former Confederacy. But Congress did not submit this to judicial rule. Members of the Associated Republican Party decried a court inflated with supremacy and declared that whenever a decision and a judgment of Congress subversives of the rights and liberties of people, it is the solemn duty of Congress to override it. 1862, Congress President Abraham Lincoln enacted legislation that banned slavery in places the Dred Scott decision had protected. Congress also drafted the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment to the Constitution, all of which advanced Congress' goal of freedom and political equality. while empowering Congress to enforce its terms of appropriate legislation. When the post-war court appeared likely to challenge the legislation, Congress considered appropriate to enforce these amendments. Congress changed the size of the court. The House of Representatives then passed a bill that prohibited the court from invalidating every federal law without the concurrence of two-thirds of the justices. Representative John Bingham of Ohio, the primary author of the 14th, insisted that such a requirement was necessary to prevent a second Dred Scott decision. Some members agreed. A push for unanimity rule concurrence among the justices instead. In the Senate, the author of the 13th Amendment, Lyndon Trumbull of Illinois, proposed that Congress declare the Reconstruction Act political in their character, the propriety of which no official tribunal is competent to question. As the threat from one pending the Supreme Court became urgent, Congress enacted a narrow but decisive measure stripping the court of appellate jurisdiction over the particular challenge before it. That strategy worked. Disciplined by Congress, the court declined to interfere with its abolition of Reconstruction. As federal prosecutors and lower courts enforced these statutes, over 750,000 black Americans voted for the first time. Black men even took seats in Congress, where they helped pass the nation's first national voting rights laws. But Congress, distracted by post-war problems and the fiendish President Andrew Johnson, did not take up the more enduring court reform that were there before. In 1870, the court emerged to finish what it had started, seizing for itself the power to decide the meaning of the amendment Congress had just drafted. The court announced that it was not appropriate for Congress to ban lynching, racial discrimination, business, or widespread century-long era of Jim Crow emerged. As Frederick Douglass lamented at a mass meeting of black voters in 1883, by claiming the power to invalidate acts of Congress and then using the power to undermine federal rights, the court had become the autocratic point of our national government. But the civil rights movement proved that the supremacy of the court was not permanent. On the urging of organizers like John Lewis, Congress repudiated the court's narrow vision of its legislative power. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 interpreted the Reconstruction Amendment differently from the court, enforcing them to ban literacy tests and establish a pre-clearance regime to prevent states from cycling through one suppression mechanism after another. The Voting Rights Act helped unleash a second Reconstruction with a surge of black voter registration and representation. But in the years that followed, the court regressed. In 1980, a decision called City of Mobile versus Boland, the court read the Voting Acts to require proof of discriminatory intent, collapsing the statute back in the court's stingier understanding of the Constitution. Congress responded in 1982 because, as Congress understood, in a world where architects of suppression keep their motives off the record, an intent requirement guarantees impunity. Instead, Congress amended the Voting Acts to overrule Boland and set an effects test, something that could be detected and fixed instead. One person who objected to Congress' response was Justice William Rehnquist, who spent his career arguing that Congress lacked authority to enforce the Reconstruction Amendment beyond the court's own cramped reading. His former law clerk, a young lawyer named John Roberts, carried that project into the Reagan administration by unsuccessfully urging the administration to block 1982 legislation. Mr. Roberts eventually replaced Justice Rehnquist in the Supreme Court and followed his mentor in seeking to restore a premise Congress had long repudiated, that the best meaning of the Reconstruction Amendment is found in the statutes to fulfill the promise, but in the late 19th century, court opinions that defied Congress. First, Shelley County versus Holder in 2013, Roberts Court dismantled the Voting Rights Act pre-clearing mechanism. Last week's ruling finished the job. If Congress does not respond, we know how this history will end, but we can draw upon the tools past Congress have offered to rebuild a more democratic constitutional. In that version, constitutional meaning is determined not by unelected judges, but by we the people and our representatives through federal lawmaking. Rejecting the court supremacy, Congress should reenact its own interpretation of the Reconstruction Amendment. To protect its interpretation from the court, should then enact a measure like those suggested by its predecessors. As the founding generation, Republicans understood the Constitution explicitly empowers the Congress to regulate the court. By contrast, the document says nothing about the court's claimed authority to regulate Congress. Instead, the court's alleged authority to defy and second-guess acts of Congress has been sustained only because the American public has so far been willing to tolerate this judicial rule, a choice that can be unmade. Lincoln understood the stakes of his choice when he warned at his inauguration in 1860 that if vital questions affecting the whole people are to be irrevocably fixed by decision of the Supreme Court, then the people have ceased to be their own rulers. Silicon Valley is bracing for a permanent underclass. Most people I know in the artificial intelligence industry think the median person is screwed and they have no idea what to do about it. I live in San Francisco among the young researchers earning million-dollar salaries and the startup founders competing to build the next unicorn. While Silicon Valley has long warned about the risk of a rogue AI, it has recently woken up to the more mundane nightmare, one in which many ordinary people lose their economic leverage as their jobs are automated away. Editorial comment. AI, I guess, is a bit scary for the next generation. Whether you talk with engineers, venture capitalists, founders, or managers, with doomers, accelerations, lefties, or libertarians, the so-called San Francisco consensus on the impact of AI for workers is bleak. Many are convinced that advanced AI will soon surpass human capabilities. This would produce tremendous growth in scientific achievement, but it will also displace millions of jobs, as fewer humans are needed to make the economy run. The technology will depress economic mobility and exacerbate inequality, while ferring power and wealth to the AI companies and existing owners of capital. The premonition is not a well-kept secret. It shows up in Anthropic Chief Executive Darlo Amato's public pronouncement about a white-collar bloodbath and a disappearing message. Signal chats in which tech executives boast about the roles they plan to automate. You feel it in the fretting of recent college graduates who applied to hundreds of jobs without landing a single interview. You heard in the gallows humor of the software engineers who joke about replacing themselves with Claude code. Some even believe that the artificial general intelligence, or AGI, will create a permanent underclass in the United States. The term underclass gained currency in the 1960s to describe the factory workers left behind by the post-war automation boom. Today it has become repopularized as a virile term for a theory that posts that people have a limited window of time to build wealth before AI and robotics are advanced enough to fully replace human labor. At that point, we will get frozen in our current class positions. The rich will be able to employ super intelligent machines to do their bidding, and everyone else will be rendered useless, unemployable, left to live off welfare scraps. Hyperbolic? Perhaps. But even those who view the idea of a permanent underclass as overblown tell me that the meme contains a kernel of truth. Yash Kadidi, 23-year-old startup founder and Stanford dropout, summarized the sentiment of his peers. There's only a matter of time before GPT-7 comes out and eats all the software, and you can no longer build a software company. Or the best versions of Tesla, Optimus, comes out and can perform all physical labor as well. In that world, this year is a human last chance to be part of the innovation. Most economists and AI experts do not expect this scenario, but the persistence of the permanent underclass idea should concern all of us. First, because it signals how much collateral damage the AI companies will tolerate en route to AGI, and second, because the production of a social underclass is a policy choice. Instead of waiting for impact, we need to think seriously now about how we plan to support workers through AI disruption. If left to its own devices, Silicon Valley may summon a permanent underclass through its own marketing logic. If you believe that humane substituting AI is inevitable, then every company should race to the one to build it and claim market valuation, the size of the economy, and then some. New AI models are assessed based on how well they do in a series of benchmarks, essentially standardization tests for the model. Increasingly, these evaluation emphasis real-world economic utility, which means that developers are aiming directly at replacing human capabilities. The AI Productivity Index benchmarks measures how frontier models perform across 4 jobs: investment banking associate, management consultant, big law associates, and primary care physicians. OpenAI established in the GTP-Val benchmark, which looks at 44 occupations from real estate brokers to news analysts. These measurements reflect AI progress, but are also directed for researchers aiming for top marks. When we originally released GDP-Val, which was just a few months ago, none of the models were yet on par with human experts. Months later, we have over 80% win rate compared to human professionals, she said. As an example, she pointed to a research colleague who used to work as a banker and who keeps being shocked by how much of her old work the model can do. This was projected by a woman by the name of Teja Patwardhan. Another editorial comment: I'm a golden oldie retired banker, and at that time you'd go into a branch and there'd be 20, 30 people in line to cash checks. You go into a branch now, you'll see one teller and maybe 2 or 3 people in line at best. And that's not from AI, that's just from technology. So it truly is for the next generation or generations. AI is a scary situation. Corporate executives accelerate layoffs, slow hiring because they don't want to be the firm lagging behind. After laying off nearly half of his company's employees in March, the Block chief executive Jack Dorsey told Wired that coding agents such as Anthropic's Opus 4.6 presented an option to dramatically change how company restructured, and certainly investors responded with a 25% stock price surge. Sometimes layoffs happen even before executives know how. When chief executives are saying they're cutting jobs because of AI, other people feel like they have to do it also. Tech workers, for their part, are scrambling for lucrative AI jobs in hopes of securing financial freedom, even when they harbor ethical hang-ups. People feel like there are not many opportunities to make money in the future, said Stephen Alder, a former employee of OpenAI's safety team. Even if someone thinks it is personally distasteful to make money from building technology, those companies say they literally kill everyone. Many people are just cogs in the machine. The apparent dissonance of technology progress is fixed. For instance, the founders of Mechanize, a once buzzy startup with a mission to enable full automation, argued in a blog that the only real choice is whether to hasten this technology revolution or wait for others to initiate it in our absence. You have been listening to a reading of articles and features from Sunday, May 3rd issue of the New York Times opinion section. We read from the New York Times opinion section every Sunday at 2 p.m. Your reader has been Dick Shanley, and thank you for listening.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have a reading of the New York Times Arts and Leisure section, followed at 4 by a rebroadcast of this morning's Buffalo News. Please stay for these readings and more throughout the day, and feel free to contact us with your comments, suggestions, with any questions you may have. following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have another print disability,